My name is Sara Busharar, and I'm a storyteller from Toronto. And today I wish to share with you a family story that my father passed down to me from his own childhood. And when people ask me how I envision democracy to be post COVID 19, I tell them this story, and I tell them that I wish that it looks the way it does in this story, with the children leading the way. My father never told us fairy tales. He stopped believing in magic. He told us real life stories that, like fairy tales, contained kings, brave young men, and monsters. He didn't share these stories much, but when he did, he paused frequently to stop his tears from rolling. See that mountain over there, Sada? When I was a child, there was a helicopter parked on that mountain every day. Every day they watched us. They watched us as we ate. And they didn't pause to stop watching us as we played. It was as if that helicopter was part of that mountain. Times were different then. My father's stories always began this way. And in the end, my brother and I wonder how different they really were. Times were different then. World War II had just ended, and poverty quickly seeped into the Hebron Hills. Most families could not afford jackets or shoes for their children. The refugee children walked from the Al Fawar refugee camp to my father's school in Dura village. Barefoot they walked up the mountains with the cold wind slapping their face. Lips cracked, cheeks chapped. They walked with haste, all the while shivering. You experienced the winter in Hebron, Sarah. You could hardly take the cold. Well, times were different then. The wooden stoves you see in the classrooms now were not there back then. The only thing keeping the children warm were the stone walls. The children arrived in their classrooms, rubbing their hands together, blowing on their fingers, trying but unable to focus on their lessons. The school bell rang and the teacher walked inside. He immediately picked on one of the students in bare feet and asked him a question. More often than not, the child was too focused on his own shivers to reply. And the teacher would take a ruler and sometimes even a belt and hit the child on his frozen hand. These were segregated classrooms. The refugee children were in different classrooms than the West Bank children. The principal, who had moved to Hebron City from Nablus and did not know the Hebron experience of the refugees, thought that the refugee children were bad influences on the West Bank children. He told the teachers to treat the refugee children differently. They abided by stricter rules and endured heavier punishments. And while the teachers had to be careful of how they treated the West Bank children, for their parents would complain, they could do as they wished to the refugee children for their parents had no say, for they were just refugees. You see, times were different then. The word of the principal was like that of God. Nobody dare question him out of fear of losing their jobs. But the children began to meet each other in the schoolyards. They began to play together and to share stories. And it is through those stories that the West Bank children quickly learned that what they were told about the refugee children was neither true nor fair. And then one day, one of the refugee boys came to the playground with his little hand bleeding. The teacher had taken the beatings to an extreme and abused the child to the point of blood. The West Bank children were outraged, heartbroken. They huddled together, and these grade 2 students came up with a plan. These 7-year-old boys decided that they would not go back inside of those classrooms until everybody shared the same classrooms and abided by the same rules. These 7-year-old boys decided to walk from their school in Dura village all the way to Hebron city to demand to speak to the Minister of Education. My father was amongst them. And when they arrived, the Minister of Education was surprised to see the boys. Ahlan! He welcomed them inside. My father watched as the Minister of Education leaned upon his desk. My father watched as the students' voices echoed one on top of the other. My father watched as the line in between the Minister of Education's eyebrows deepened with each word he heard. And when the boys were finished, the Minister of Education rose up. He thanked the boys. He told them that he had no idea of what was happening in one of his own classrooms. He immediately fired the principal, and the segregated schools were abolished. And what about the boys? The boys walked back to their classrooms feeling an inch taller. And that was the first schoolyard resistance that my father took part of, one of many. And from that day on, the teachers knew their power, but so did the students. And many, many, many years later, I went back to that same refugee camp, and I worked doing art therapy with the boys, grade 10-year-old boys. And I asked them to draw a picture representing home, and I told them that they could either work in groups, in pairs, or alone. Most of the students decided to work in groups, but there was one little boy. He was smaller than the rest, and he sat in the very back of the room, and he worked alone. And while all the other boys were finished drawing their pictures and were now writing poetry and stories, this little boy was still drawing. Well, I walked up to him and I looked down to see what was so important that this child was still drawing. And this child had drawn a Star of David in the middle of a Palestinian flag. And for a minute, there was peace. And then the teacher came and she looked down and she asked him what he had drawn. And he said, to her why he has the Star of David in the middle of the Palestinian flag, and he looked up at me and he said, because she is Jewish and I like her, so she's welcome inside of my home. And for a minute, there was peace. And then the teacher looked up at the classroom and with a loud voice announced, this is Sarah Abu Sharar. She is Palestinian from Dura, Hebron. You heard her speaking English because she lives in Canada, and she looks a little bit different because her mother is Yugoslavian. And the little boy took his pencil and he scratched out the Star of David and he left the Palestinian flag. But for a minute, there was peace.